have a question about your question. So let's go one step up.
Look, there's nothing outside the text. It's all questions all the way down,
go, baby.
Man.
Yes, let's go. Hello, this is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Gil. Here with me today is Lillian.
Hi, Gil.
Owen.
Hey.
And Will.
What's going on, man?
And we're very excited to be joined by a guest today, Joel Michael Reynolds. Joel is an assistant professor of philosophy and disability studies at Georgetown University, a senior research scholar in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, and a senior advisor to the Hastings Center. He's written extensively on questions concerning the nature and meaning of disability and its relationship to fundamental issues in philosophy and social theory. Joel's articles have appeared in numerous journals, and he himself founded the Journal of Philosophy of Disability. Definitely keep an eye out in the next few months for 2 books that are coming out. In March, he's publishing a book called The Life Worth Living, Disability, Pain, and Morality with the University of Minnesota Press. And in May, Routledge is publishing the Disability Bioethics Reader, which Joel co-edited with Christine Weisler. Joel's work pushes us to ask difficult questions about the way in which our concepts of ability and disability are intertwined with seemingly more familiar structures of power, such as white supremacy, sexism, and capital. And he encourages us to develop a more critical and nuanced grasp of the mostly silent but deeply significant link between bodies, normativity, and power. I'm sure I'm not alone in having a lot of questions to ask Joel. Disability is an incredibly important and I think relatively under-theorized aspect of leftist theory and practice, as it forms a backdrop against which we think about lives worth living in the first place. The question of what kinds of life are worth living and the tacit assumptions we tend to hold about the value of different forms of life is, as Joel shows us, a historically variable and politically dispositive matter, one that constitutes a site of ongoing struggle and contestation. It's sort of hard to know where to begin, especially because I imagine that disability studies is sort of unfamiliar territory for at least some of our listeners. I think I'd like to start by asking you, Joel, about the distinction between disability and impairment, which is often central to a lot of these discussions, but it's a distinction that you think, as far as I understand, might not be so neat or might actually be problematic in itself. So I think that might hopefully open the door for a broader conversation about disability, philosophy, and left politics. So, just to get things going, what is this difference between impairment and disability, broadly construed? How has that difference been invoked, and what are some of the issues at play in making and challenging that sort of distinction? Also, hello. I should have said hi.
Thank you so much.
Welcome, Joel.
Hi, Joel.
Hi,
Sorry for
everybody.
Gil. Hey, Joel.
Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Now we're
it's a real pleasure to be here.
overcompensating.
I'm a big fan of the show. I've been listening, I think, since the very beginning, and I really love what y'all are up to and the sort of conversations you're having. So it's truly an honor and a pleasure to be here and get to chat with you today. That's a great opening question, Gil. I think let's jump in. So a little bit of Disability Studies 101, what is called the social model of disability, though in truth there are social models, there is no one variation of this, is usually thought to have this core distinction at play between disability and impairment. And the way this is usually explained is quite simple. Impairment refers to the differences, perhaps you could even say the abnormalities or atypicalities of people's bodies. And disability refers to how people, how societies, how structures, how political institutions respond to impairment. And the moment you have this, again, very basic, very heuristic distinction in hand, you can immediately start to pick out cases where the problem that, say, someone who has an impairment leading them to use a wheelchair for mobility, the problems that they face in the world will not necessarily be merely a question of that impairment full stop, but of how the world around them responds to that way of getting around. And the example that I still use, even though it's been talked about 1,000 times, I think anyone who's a good TikToker knows this, but if you use a wheelchair and you are out and about, and then you come across a long flight of stairs, on a social model, you can say, well, even though the person may be impaired in this or that way, the problem here is design. The problem here is architecture. The problem here is societal, because someone chose. There was, well, probably multiple people chose for that, for those stairs to be built, as opposed to some other mode of getting from point A to B across an incline. This distinction, and I think this is extremely important for people to appreciate who are first kind of coming into disability studies, this in some ways is the most radical, important distinction about disability in history. I mean, this has just, I cannot possibly overstate how crucial this has been for disability activism, disability politics, and not just in the global north, but in many, many, many places around the world. Having said that, as with all, or as with most political tools, it is purposely simplistic, and it doesn't quite take us, I don't think, any disability activists, certainly not more recent people working under the banner of disability justice, it doesn't take us quite far enough to appreciate the actual lived complexity of disabled people's lives and just people's lives more generally. And that's what brings us to, there's a whole history here of, especially from the mid-90s forward, of people critiquing the social model, saying it's outdated, saying it's insufficient in X, Y, or Z ways. And I do think most of those critiques, there is something to them, but I don't want us to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because obviously throwing babies is never an appropriate action.
Yeah, no, I think we agree with that on the pod. That
Good.
least radical statement, but I won't speak for Gil.
Yeah, I guess. Fine.
If I could just stick with this for a little bit and ask you to say a little more about it, you kind of track the way that some people have responded to the way that the distinction between impairment and disability can erase complexity. Some people have responded to that with the desire to kind of deconstruct it entirely, right? And so you address a pretty post-structuralist move that tries to say that there is no such thing as like a pre-discursive impairment that is a pure referent or something that then gets taken up into a more constructed and socially determined concept like a disability. So it seems to an extent that you sympathize with some of that gesture, but like you just said, right, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that, well, there's everything about impairment is just also socially constructed, linguistic, et cetera. So if you could you say a little bit more about how you see, I guess, the mediation between impairment and disability, right? The way that they're mediated with one another rather than just collapsed into one or the other, right? Collapsed either into a social constructivist model or into a positivist, in the pejorative sense, model.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a great question.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm actually wondering if we could go one step backward and just like what some of the, like, what is it? What are the complexities that are being missed? Like, what's the dissatisfaction between that distinction between impairment and disability? Because, like, I'm totally want to hear what you said about Owen's question too, which is that like you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater just because it's insufficient in some ways. But I wasn't super clear about what those ways were and like how it kind of pushed people into, as Owen was saying, this like kind of radical social constructivist position that you're now assessing.
Yeah, so one of my favorite books or works in general to go to think about this particular critique is Susan Wendell's, I think it's a 1995 book called The Rejected Body. And she's writing out of experiences of chronic pain and chronic illness. And she says, and this is almost a direct quote, she says, look, there are some types of suffering that a just world cannot fix. A perfectly just world, one that has no ableism, no sexism, no whatever. And obviously, that's a utopic in a qualified sense. Whenever I say that word around Will, I want to be very careful. Correct me if I'm wrong, Will, please. That is just wrong, Wendell says. For example, if you have neuropathic pain, a perfectly accessible world is not going to fix your neuropathic pain. As far as we can tell, as far as we've learned about pain, and pain sciences have grown massively since the 70s, neuropathic pain, even though it's something that requires a kind of multidisciplinary approach, and even though increasingly clinicians and researchers understand that it's a combination of physiological and psychological factors, it's still the case that probably you're going to need something like morphine or opioids, or you're going to need some kind of intervention at the level of physical and biochemical interactions to mitigate and or manage that sort of pain. Again, in at least some of the cases. Obviously, neuropathic pain is a very big umbrella term, so we would need to get more specific. But this is all to say the disability activists who are, fighting for things like more anti-discrimination protections, or even fighting for a constitutional approach to disability that would afford basic rights that are needed, that will still not fix some of the ways in which there are impairments that in and of themselves, and what precisely that means, let's say at the level of the body, insofar as we can abstractly think about it outside of social formations or social orders, that's where the problem is. You need a biomedical fix for something like neuropathic pain. I'll give another example, and maybe hopefully this will help clarify it even further. Epilepsy. Now, if you do your good historical and anthropological work, you know that in many different places across time, and even some places today, what we call under the rubric of modern medicine, Western medicine today, epilepsy, was viewed as a visitation from the gods. It was a spiritual experience, and often it would move the person who experienced that would potentially be put into the priestly class, or there would be a really significant and arguably positive response to that form of embodiment. Epilepsy, I also like as an example because there are physiological components to it, but there are psychological ramifications. There's a lot going on with epilepsy. Now, on the one hand, someone who takes a genealogical approach might say, look, doesn't that difference, historical and culturally, prove that the meaningfulness of epilepsy is just socially constructed? And I want to say, I see your point. I see where you're going there. There is something to that. And yet, I don't think that the person who lives in the society where epilepsy is interpreted as a visitation from the gods, there's some magically different thing going on at the level of the gray matter in their brain. I think there's something similar going on here. Well, theoretically, how can we point to that? We have to use the tools of something like referring to something real, referring to some underlying physiological difference, in other words, an impairment, that even though the meaningfulness of it and the way in which a person will experience it will be scaffolded in perhaps wildly different ways across cultural and historical contexts, there's still something there that we can point to and say that the ancient Greek person who's described in whatever text you want to talk about that was being visited from the gods, they had epilepsy. And it's not anachronistic to say that in the sense in which I'm specifying the similarity, even though, of course, on some other historical sense, that's completely anachronistic to say that. So I'm wanting to just try and be very, what I hope is that the people who really push for this genealogical kind of approach, some of whom are more social constructionists in the pejorative sense than others, I just want there to be a little more nuance. I like this approach. It does things that I think are very helpful, but it sometimes just goes too far.
Yeah, I mean, this is very bare bones. But what I was getting when I was reading your work on this, especially with the notion of chronic pain, and again, this is very reductive, but this is my first time telling y'all about this. But I actually do have a chronic pain disease that requires me to get biomedical infusions every 2 months. And when I was a teenager, I would be in chronic pain. I had to drop out of school. I couldn't get out of bed. And and doctors just like for a long time didn't know what was wrong with me. And I remember my dad, because he had no answers. He just kind of fell back on this whole sort of mind over matter thing, like you just need to orient yourself to your life differently rather than giving in to what this is. And I'm saying this not to dunk on my dad. I get if you don't have any other answers, then it seems like really appealing to try to situate this thing that's happening in your body and say no, this is something contextual that you can sort of excavate. But for the person in chronic pain, there's nothing that feels discursive about it. If anything, if there is something discursive, it's at least extra discursive. But I would say there is something pre-discursive about your body in a very real sense turning against you, not allowing you to complete projects that you want to complete. And I think taking pain seriously, I get there are more sophisticated ways of talking about social construction, but I do worry about, this whole, it's all historically variable. And so, we're not just pushing back against people contemporarily. Sartre sometimes does have a weird thing. He once says this weird thing, Critique of Dialectical Reason, of people in a culture who it just wasn't part of their culture to eat very often. So they would just go weeks without eating. And he's like, yeah, of course, because that's a part of their historical project. He's like, I think this might have been one of your more hyperbolic moments.
John Paul.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I really wish it were that way, but I don't think so. And so the question I wanted to ask you, and then maybe you want to go back to Owen's question, but I think it links up, is in what you gave us, you start talking about genomics. And I think a lot of people on the left are really suspicious of, talking about genes and, what kind of truth or evidence that they give us for good reasons. You are very well aware of, the kind of eugenic projects that can happen when we start saying genes determine X, genes determine this predisposition. But you're arguing for a more nuanced position of we cannot just ignore the type of evidence and knowledge we can get from these sophisticated technologies. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about why you're hold on, we have to slow down even when it comes to genomics.
Yeah, and Owen, you'll have to jump back in a second so that I remember to come back to your original question.
It's all good. It's being addressed obliquely, I feel. We're good.
Okay. Well, if the obliqueness starts bothering you, we can make it more direct. Yeah, regarding the hesitancy on the left, I am one of these, whenever I encounter these discourses, especially at the level of kind of national media sort of stuff, where everything's being highly condensed and or simplified relative to the underlying research, I do get very suspicious. I get suspicious because it is so often the case that at the level of let's just go with the public imaginary, and I'm including, people who have up through at least a college education, let's say, something like that, at the level of the public imaginary, it feels as though people are making claims about the truth of a person's body. And on the one hand, there is something about genomic information that tells us about individual bodies. It even tells us about groups at the level of genetic cohorts. So that I don't think is contested. The trick is, what is the meaningfulness of a gene or a genome, right? What is that object of inquiry? And how does that relate to what goes on in an appointment with your general practitioner? Or what goes on when public health policy professionals are trying to decide how they should shape a particular intervention that's supposed to be targeted at a group that's perceived to be a vulnerable population. And it's at the level of how the information is taken up and what that information is assumed to be saying that I think a lot of the nuance is dropping out. And so a different way to put this is that there are many, many different sorts of conditions where having insights into the genomic drivers behind it or genomic considerations of it is helpful, period. It's helpful. It's helpful to clinicians. It might be helpful at the level of even an individual understanding something fundamental about their body and maybe being able to enter into groups with other people who have a similar underlying, genetic or genomic situation. This is something that I really like this piece by 𝙁𝙗𝙙𝙘 called "We Have Seen the Mutants and They Are Us" or something like this. We'll put it in the show notes. And she talks about how her daughter Sasha, they had never bothered doing any genetic or genomic testing to figure out whether there was an underlying genomic cause to Sasha's form of embodiment and the types of care that she needed and all this stuff, until her seizures got worse. They ran out of options clinically to kind of figure out what the hell was going on. They run this test and they find out she has what's called Pura syndrome. You can't figure this out. You don't know you have Pura syndrome without genomic information. And one of the really positive things that came from this was that now Sasha and her family can interact with other people who have this condition. There's now a whole body of localized knowledge and belonging, a sense of belonging with the community that would not have happened without this stuff that otherwise might be like, oh, it's genetically reductive or whatever. So I want to allow that can be positive. And yet, when something like Vital, the drug that was marketed solely to African Americans for hypertension, and then there is some stuff in the media that talks about underlying genetic or genomic differences as part of the rationale for the development of this drug, then I'm like, fuck, stop. This is not capturing the complexity. In that case in particular, there's an egregious conflation between the social political category of African American and underlying genetic cohort differences. Those are not isomorphic. And yet the way it was talked about at the level of the media, even at the level of the FDA, for goodness sake, the way it was talked about ran roughshod in many cases over the complexity of the science that was being referred to. And so I really, the translational move from basic research being done in genomics, or hell, basic research in any number of domains that apply to human and non-human animal life, the translational work from that basic stuff to how it gets taken up by the public, there has to be better ways to do this. I mean, better basic education, scientific education, that's definitely one component. There's lots of things that we need to do. But that's where I think the problem really lies, is more of a translational thing. It's not that genomics is bad in and of itself, or that genomics is fundamentally eugenic. I just don't think those claims, they do not relate to reality. That's just someone yelling into the wind because they don't like it.
That's super interesting. So if I could maybe pick this up and ask you to clarify a little bit more, I really appreciate this idea that there's a non-isomorphism, right? Between, on the one hand, something like genomic formations or groups of genomic characteristics or attributes, and then phenotypes, which are which are almost to the very bottom socially constructed, right?
Yeah.
Phenotypical differentiation is a difference in kind than the sort of thing that is picked out by genomic research. And so it's a very tricky balancing act, because I think you're right that in the public consciousness, these things are thought to have a more one-to-one relationship than they in fact do, which shapes things like questions of policy, even at the level of research done, right? Or the discussions that we have, the example that you gave just now about this drug marketed specifically to African Americans. There's not even a clear one-to-one relationship at all between anything like a genotype and the phenotype there. Nope. So when you talk about this question of the meaning then of something like ability or disability, how does this relate to this distinction or problem?
Yeah, great. So I think I like the way you phrase that. One of the, from the areas that I work in, one of the things that scares me the most about a lot of contemporary discourse on the left, let's say, is this failure in often cases to appreciate differences that make a difference, while wanting, on the one hand, to appreciate those differences and celebrate them, and then move towards some more universalizing vision of the world, whether it's rooted in human rights discourse, whether it's rooted, pick your favorite theory. And part of what I find worrisome about a lot of that discourse is that it's ignoring the complexity that is actually going on in research in the life sciences, which does give us actually a bunch of very interesting tools, like, for example, the ability to distinguish between racial categories and genetic cohorts and talk about them as being not isomorphic, and giving us a toolbox to talk about the fact that we do know that there are something like, genome-wide association studies give us really interesting insights into the drivers of group differences. And it is really helpful to know that those group differences just don't map on to how we carve up the world at the level of how we identify different groups. Like, that's really helpful. Also, insofar as understanding underlying genomic drivers does give us better tools for certain sorts of interventions, why in the hell would we want to throw that toolbox out? I don't think the problem is necessary. Like I said before, it's not so much, the problem is not the research being done per se. It's the way in which that research is being translated and taken up in actual social political life that worries me. So to go back to where I think your question was going, when we talk about something like epilepsy, when we talk about something like major depression, when we talk about something like vitiligo, when we talk about something like Down syndrome, when we talk about something like being deaf, either in the sense of someone who's deaf and understands that as a loss, or someone who's deaf, capital D, and understands that as belonging to a signing community. One of the things that worries me about some of the debate in philosophy of disability and how this is leveraged in other spheres, and also some of the debates even within disability activism, is that we do not have a rich enough, nuanced enough, complex enough taxonomy of differences at the level of what these mean for people's understanding of their ability and or disability state in the world. So for example, I know people who have epilepsy, who identify as an epileptic, but who do not identify as disabled. I also know people who have epilepsy, who being epileptic for them means they are disabled in the sense of being part of the disabled community. And you could run this sort of analysis with lots of different, the ways that we mark out the kind of ability disability system, to invoke the way Rosemary Garland Thompson likes to talk about this. And if we keep running into this, like, oh, but is there an underlying genomic difference? Or, oh, but is there an underlying, etiology of X, Y, or Z sense? Or on the other hand, we go to, oh, well, this is just a question of community belonging. This is just a question of the extent to which someone finds themselves as part of, those routes of inquiry, if they are not mapped up to a larger picture of the complexity of this, I think can easily mislead us. Disability is just too complex, too heterogeneous, too multifactorial to take any one of these ways of defining it as definitive for the meaning of whatever the particular disability or ability in question is. So I guess what I'm trying to say is one of my bigger concerns in the work that's being done is that it is still too narrow. To take a great example, Elizabeth Barnes's book, The Minority Body, which is absolutely astonishing. If you have not read it, everyone on earth should read this book. Came out in 2016. It's, I think, one of the best pieces of scholarship I've read in 10 or 20 years in any domain. Right at the beginning, she says, look, I'm limiting my account to physical disabilities. She's super honest and super humble, and it's just like, it gets too complicated if I also do what I'm trying to do and talk about psychological disabilities. Now, on the one hand, I love that humility and that way of acknowledging the heterogeneity of disability. And on the other hand, I'm like, okay, well, we got to talk more about all the stuff that's being left out here. We also got to talk about how, for example, how do you carve out just physical disabilities when so many forms of quote unquote physical impairment have psychological ramifications and or are in a loop that cannot be fundamentally abstracted apart with one another. Like the relationship between depression and multiple sclerosis for the first few years after the diagnosis. How the hell do you pick that apart? I don't see any way to do it. So again, I'm very grateful that someone like Barnes is being honest and displaying intellectual humility and kind of, carving out a space for the inquiry she's undertaking. But on the flip side, I'm like, we have to start taking this complexity head on. I think that there's just not going to be progress, or whatever that means, progress in quotation marks, without doing that.
Leading off from that, so one of the other pieces we read of yours was on disability and critical philosophy of race. That's a coming out in a super cool journal called Critical Philosophy of Race, next issue. Y'all should check it out. Great editorial staff as well.
I've heard they're pretty cool. I've heard that, yeah.
Yeah, this word on the street. And so I wanted to to again make very clear to our listeners, like, what are the really serious political and policy stakes of this. So, in some areas of academic research that one could categorize as genomic study or even sort of like evolutionary biology, there are people who try to defend the thesis that, the reason why you find higher crime rates amongst Black people is that there is a genetic predisposition at the level of the group, whether it's depressed IQ rates or inhibited moral valuation, that explains that in a way that something like systemic racism, poverty, or one's zip code simply does not. And the reason why they are making this argument, and it is people who would probably identify themselves as liberals, realist liberals, but they might sound like conservatives to us, is that this is a waste of money trying to fix something that's fundamentally unfixable at the level of genes. And so when I hear you talking about we need to really,
this is the bell curve argument.
Yeah, it's a new version of the bell curve.
Yeah,
argument.
But it's constantly getting a new gloss. It's constantly getting a new gloss saying, maybe he didn't get it right, but we do need to be serious about people's capacities. Right. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more on what you start to talk about in that article and in the another piece that you're talking about is the relationship even between a socio-political system like capitalism or a socio-economic system like capitalism and the arrangement of this notion of ability and capacity. Which bodies are being seen as ones that you want to invest in, and which bodies are made to appear as, well, there's not much you can do with those. And so these are just limits. These are drags on the economy, drags on the culture. And to show that even we talk a lot about capitalism on this show, but this sort of eugenic and biological notion of reasoning is very often not very far behind of trying to decide which populations are going to be ones deserving of concern or ones that are being made available to expropriation or exploitation.
Yes. Thanks so much for that question. Yeah, I think that one way to or a potential entry point to answer it is just to say that as far as I can tell historically, and I'll limit myself to the United States just because I should for the purposes of this claim, it is not clear to me that you can understand the political concept of citizenship and the way in which that actually plays out across the history of this country without understanding the linkage between, the intimate, interconnected linkage between processes of racialization and processes of, let's say, habilitation and debilitation, or I guess that's maybe the least awkward way to phrase that. What do I mean? Well, for example, when categories like the moron and the idiot, these were terms of art, medical terms of art, early 20th century, late 19th century, when these were created, they were applied differentially based upon various forms of racialization, not just applied differentially to non-white folk, but also applied differentially across what we would today maybe think of as, interwhite differences, Italian, however you want to carve all of that stuff up. And the function of the combination of race and ability status was precisely in order to relegate some people to poverty and or menial labor and or putting them in an institution where then their labor could be extracted completely free, also known as a form of slavery. Like most institutions, the vast majority in the United States had labor. They were essentially labor camps. They just weren't called that. And fast forward to today, and this is one of the arguments that, I'm not even close to the first person to say this. Chris Bell said something similar in the 90s. Lydia Exley Brown has been talking about this for years. But today, when you look at the mass incarceration system in the United States, and you learn that at a bare minimum, at least half of people inside of our prison and jail system are disabled in some sense. Whether we categorize that as intellectual disabilities, mental health disabilities, or any number of other sets of disabilities, institutionalization hasn't gone anywhere. It's just we talk about it differently. And because of the loophole in the 13th Amendment, as I hope everyone is aware, right, this is just slavery under a different name. And you have people working either literally for free or they're, it's like 10 cents an hour or something like this, whatever it might be. So this is a long buildup to say that if you look at the highly damaging, targeted socio-political practices like mass incarceration, leading from, among other sources, Nixon's war on drugs, which he just admitted was his way of targeting Black communities and also the quote-unquote hippies in that famous tape. If you look at that, if you tie that up with the continuation, I mean, calling it a resurgence is, I think, in some ways inaccurate, the continuation of white supremacy at so many different levels, local, state, and federal, in terms of the way policies are played out, in terms of the way the justice system is structured, in terms of the way that voting rights are configured. There's an argument to be made that the eugenics that we talk about as like, oh yeah, the US and the UK did that at the turn of the 20th century. Man, that was shitty. We were so good at it. The Nazis,
glad we cut that out.
Yeah. And then the Nazis are like, great plans. We're just you gave us the blueprint. Like, thank you, Jim Crow South. Like, rock on. And then we say, oh, but this went away. And my argument is, it hasn't gone away at all. If anything, it's stronger in many respects. It's just slightly, if you're not knowing where to look, if one is looking in the wrong places, it's perhaps slightly more vague, partially because all the language we use is trying very hard to cover over what's happening, right? The way that the mass incarceration system as we have it just keeps, you just saw this a number of months ago. We keep coming back to, but crime rates, it's like how many times is this lie going to continue to be used? Anyway, I've kind of gotten off track.
Can I ask you a question about this? So
yes.
So it is vague, but it's also like more subtle. I think part of like the worry, I wonder if you could speak about like the anxieties for these reasons that like some people, scholars and activists have about like medicalization, because it ties directly into these ways of framing these conversations about, who is or is not, problematic due to a perceived lack, deficiency, or abnormality, atypicality, as you put it. How are we to think of this at the same time holding together this idea with what you said before about the fact that certain sorts of genomic research does seem to point to something real that we want to say still is real, right? Like, how are we, it's a 𝙁sort of thing, right? Like how can we hold on to that there is like a reality here while being aware of the dangers of like a particularly pernicious sort of medicalization given like these legacies of white supremacy and so forth?
Great question. I used to think that this was just like squaring a circle and that there was really no way to get around this tension, or perhaps that there's something like a parallax going on here where, those two ways of carving up the world are just, they're not only different ways of carving up, but you can never get them back in alignment. And these days, I'm not so sure. And the reason I'm not so sure is political, because it seems to me that the problem, or let's say this tension between a focus on individual difference and a positing of individual and or group differences as a causal, explanation for whatever it is we're talking about, versus the goals, the political goals of equity and justice, those don't have to fight with one another. You could use the positing of certain differences in such a way that you still make a more just world. And if you, for example, viewed those positing of those differences ultimately as a heuristic, ultimately as merely a tool on the way to, for example, develop policies that actually help currently disenfranchised people, as opposed to policies that are mainly just sought at the level of the universal. This is one of the things Bernie got yelled at so much in 2015, 2016, is like, stop saying free, this for everyone. Like, that's not, we need different, and there's a whole argument about how things like reparations should be thought about, whether they should be thought about at the level of the system as a whole or individual groups. I would defer to people like my colleague 𝙁𝙤𝙙𝙘𝙀 on that debate. So my answer is something like, the solution has to be political to this tension. And I don't think the right political solution is to say, fuck genomics and fuck all of this research, and we're just going to ignore it. And also to say that it is fundamentally eugenic in the negative sense. I just don't think that gets us anywhere, because it's a question of how we take it up, how we use it, and our relationship to it as a way of doing research in the life sciences. A way that, by the way, this has been a very humanistic conversation so far, but like there's really interesting stuff going on about non-human animals, about genomics is not just something that gives insight into humans. I just want to make that clear as well. One more thing I'll just add that I'm not sure, this will maybe get to a thread that I think both you and Will were getting at. One of the reasons I am so adamant that I think philosophers, even ones who don't, claim the mantle of doing philosophy of disability, need to think more carefully about the meaning of ability and disability, of the I can and the I cannot, of the way we talk about capacities. And as I provocatively have said in more than one spot, you show me a political theory that doesn't articulate something like capacity, and I'll give you $1 million. Like you can't get a political theory off the ground without having some sort of a metaphysics or ontology or whatever word you want to use that posits what the unit of inquiry, whether it's the agent, the citizen, the group, the locale, the community, that what they can do. We have to think about this more deeply, because historically, it seems to me that one of the primary drivers of injustice is to constitute problems at the level of the individual's body.
Yeah.
And that is really, really problematic. It's Rawls. Let's just put it this way. I don't see how your average Rawlsian can actually address this problem. I don't see how your average utilitarian can address this problem. If anything, they lean hard on a kind of naive concept of ability. And yes, I mean all of them, the rule ones, the act one, all the variations.
They can carve themselves up as nicely as they want. They're still having that sort of metaphysical presupposition, which, as you're talking, not to interrupt you, but it's like, I just realized, I talk about capacities all the time. I don't know how to talk about politics without talking about the capacity to do something. And what I found while reading you is that, I almost experienced a strange intellectual frustration of I don't know how not to use that language. That when I'm trying to make a political argument of the world should be thus, or, we should do this in order to, even the in order to is the in order to what? What am I envisioning, the normative capacity as being frustrated? And so let me give two hugely different examples of how I think this comes in. So there's a type of, we can call an ethical Marxism or an ethical politics of, we should be able to enjoy our lives as X, be able to do this, be able to contest that. Or there's, this more sort of scientific Marxism where it's not about ethics, it's about, science. That, the problem is, we should be able to know the world, apart from, these obfuscations, distortions, etc. But on all those accounts, you have to posit some notion of, so what is the norm or the form of the capacity we are trying to help people get to? And when I start thinking that way, I do start realizing, even if it's not explicit, that I have an idea of what body am I seeing that I'm trying to help constitute that will be able to do these things, with what hands, with what legs, with what mind. And so you entered me into this metaphysical quandary that, yes, it's political, but it revealed me that it's not something you can hand wave away. It's not something like you can virtue signal away and say oh, but I don't do capacity political theory. I do non-capacity. And people, then what do you fighting for? What are you talking about?
I don't do that.
What is that?
One of the reasons why I don't think there's an easy way out of the problem of capacity or dealing with the category of capacity is precisely something that you made clear, Joel, which is that the way that oppression has been naturalized, the way that many different forms, if not all forms of oppression, have been naturalized, right, discursively, is by putting them on the plane of capacity and incapacity, right?
Yep.
That's the way, not just, you gave the example of slavery. That's the justification for why slavery, or at least the justification given for why slavery had to exist, was because, basically black people don't possess the same capacities. And so there needs to be this patronizing system of tutelage and care But I mean, there's even more less extreme examples of the reason why people push back against, worker control and unionization is the supposed, lack of capacity or the absence of certain capacities, right? That would render them able to have a kind of autonomous or self-managerial kind of structure. And so I wonder, just to go back to the question of politics then, and how you see politics of disability coming out of your analytical framework, what you think of do you think politics has something inevitably to do with a process of like capacitation, of like building capacities, and what kind of praxis is involved in the way that you see the politics of disability engaging the question of capacities, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's great. So yes, to what you just said, I am very fond of the idea of thinking of politics at base, politics in this broad sense, as a process of capacitization. Cool. And unfortunately, I'm not really sure how you can engage in any process of capacitization without there being also debilitation built into it. Either built into it explicitly or built into it by what Sina Kramer would call a constitutive exclusion. Mm-hmm. This is all to say I'm very pessimistic about how far or how close to adjust anything we could ever get. So just bracket my pessimism for a moment there. I think we could do, don't get me wrong, we could do way better than we are doing. I just don't.
Thank you for saying that. This is not the best of all possible worlds.
This is not even close to the best. I don't want that to
another
be
L for Leibniz. Put it on the board.
One of many.
But so let me back up one second and just bring back up the question of capitalism, right? And the role that labor under a capitalist economic system plays. And I don't want to get into the weeds with various Marx, so let me just stay at a very high level of generality. Insofar as nation building projects, settler colonial nation building projects like the United States are engaged in a politics of capacitization of the citizens for whom they want to do the best, which at the beginning was, I guess, arguably just white landed property owning, very, very small slice was, working for their well-being above all else. Insofar as capitalism builds in a driver towards the labor of individuals being that by which they are recognized as having value in the larger system. Insofar as that's baked into it, that labor that one has to produce and produce relative to the values of a capitalist system, then there is a fundamentally, and again, this is not new, there's a fundamentally extractive relationship where it's not simply that you have to posit value and worth as in the individual's body, but what you can get out of it, or what, if we want to make it a little more passive, is gotten out of it through the various forms of disciplining, to invoke Foucault, and forms of other shaping that the larger socioeconomic political order puts any given individual through. And capitalism, then, there is an argument to be made that insofar as as capitalist modes of production are built into this nation-building project that has a politics of capacitization for the few, the privileged few, and not for others, you need all sorts of debilitating mechanisms to make sure that the goods and the values keep going to that elite privileged class and do not get more justly distributed. And the fact that we right now have the highest levels of inequality we have ever had in the United States since before the Great Depression, relative to the last, 150 years, obviously not relative to the beginning, wherever that beginning is, not 1776, obviously, 1619, wherever we put the marker. This says something really fascinating to me, that this is happening at the exact same time, or as part of the same processes as the civil rights movement, the disability rights movement, women's rights movement, all of these things that were thought to, or were trying to equalize the capacitization process. Now we get this huge economic siphoning, very, very powerful economic siphoning, and one that has been, to be very clear, not merely laid out by one side of American politics, but has been supported through and through by both sides. Just one side likes to, throw more crumbs out.
Moldy crumbs, but yeah.
Moldy crumbs. Yes. And often crumbs that it's too late to even satiate hunger at that point.
Feeding the hunger of 20 years ago. Yeah.
Okay, so I had this question a while ago where I can't remember who asked you about the political implications of this. You actually had a really nice phrase in one of your essays where you said, the stakes of this are whether or not we are at bottom unequal with respect to our bodily capacities, and do we have to just learn to deal with inequality or not? What I gathered, and I'm not sure that you quite connected it this way, but what I thought was that it just seems like that's kind of like the foundational question, like what's at stake is actually just like how we think about equality in general, in the abstract. And then your claim is that like radical social constructivism is just not able to do that adequately. Like it doesn't have the resources. And I think that like, forgive me for being kind of trite, but like when you made your argument that there's like a there when we're talking about impairments, I just thought this was the most obvious thing in the world. And like, I love the way you laid it out and I thought it was very clarifying, but I actually have the experience of like reading radical social constructivist stuff and like just like hyper post-structuralism. And I actually didn't realize until like several years after getting that kind of like my feet in the water or toes in the pond or whatever with that kind of literature, that people were actually serious when they were saying everything was just everything was just discursive. And then once I was shocked. I was like, what do you mean? Like, what are you talking about? Like, how can you build a politics around different capacities? So like, people's bodies matter differently. Like, Texas is like banning abortions and like people who need abortions like need that to not be the case. And you saying my body is socially constructed at like the most fundamental possible level. There's just something that's just like, it's politically like a dead end to me. Like there's complex questions I understand about gender identity and so on.
And it's stupid in the technical sense of stupid, not the ableist sense of stupid. It's a stupid argument.
But like, you know what I mean? But it's just like, I get that there's like complex things we want to say about how bodies matter socially and politically, but like fundamentally they do matter. Like there is a there that we're talking about and people have access to things differently because of them. And like, this is just kind of a broad thing. Like, I just didn't know people really meant it. I thought we were actually just talking about social constructivism in like the normal way. And then I actually since I joined Twitter, I see a lot of like really radical social constructivist stuff. Like it's all the way down the discourse, and it's all the way down the social. And I'm kind of wondering, like, how did we get to this place? Because I feel like, I think you're right, that the problem is whether or not we're fundamentally unequal and how we deal with inequality. And you can't answer that question if you can't admit that there's like a thing that we're talking about. You end up just being like, yeah, there's all these differences and there's no like problem here we're dealing with. So like, what are we doing as like what in the world are you building a political strategy around? That's how you just get like culturalism in like the worst sense, where like you actually do just have to strategize at the level of like having a hegemonic discourse, and that's how we're going to do politics. So that's a little like woo out there, but like, how do you think we got here? Like, why does this intervention need to be made? I'm genuinely curious.
Maybe just as a one other question to tack onto that, which is that what is denying any pre or extra discursive element of a syndrome or of a disability? Like, what does that even mean? Like to say that there's no. I mean, I get one claim, a more limited claim, which is that our epistemic relationship to the way we come to know disabilities and the way we come to know things like syndromes is always mediated through cultural and discursive categories. And we can't just have some kind of pure cognitive access to these things that happen in the body. But I don't know, maybe it's a similar stupefaction. Maybe I don't understand what it would mean to say that there is nothing extra discursive. There's nothing but language, like when it comes to these aspects of embodiment.
And if I could also tack on to that, I know, Joel, like we're like piling it up, but I just want to say, like,
wait, I have another question. Let me add.
Thing.
I have a question about your question, so let's go one step up.
Look, there's nothing outside the text. It's all questions all the way down,
baby.
Yes,
but,
let's go.
The really quick thing that I will say about where I sometimes see this radical social constructionism goes is that it's a way of avoiding really hard political questions. That if it is the case that you use the example of someone, if they have some sort of I forget the term used, genetic coding, they will develop, I believe, MS at some point in their lives.
I think I was talking about Huntington's, but yeah.
Huntington's, sorry. Huntington's
disease.
Huntington's. It's a way of making this sort of wishful statement of, actually it turns out if we made the real perfect culture, none of these would be real problems. That depression would, no longer be a thing that is out there, or someone who suffers from chronic pain, as we said, you were talking about in the beginning, that even in a perfectly just world, there'll probably be people who suffer from chronic pain. And it's a way of not dealing with the fact that what if you really want this one model of capacity, and what you're trying to talk about is like, maybe there's a way where we won't have to deal with all of these messy bodily realities. That, it actually is, sort of easy sort of universalism where these aren't hard political questions of how do we deal with real differences that, are going to be there even if we solve every problem. And so it's a way of wishing it away or bracketing it out, these hard questions.
Yeah. Okay, there's no way I'm going to sufficiently address that triplet of questions, but let's see here.
Would you like me to add? I can make it a fourth.
Yeah, make a fourth. Let's go all the way.
Yeah, do you think it's true that the CIA is the reason why we got to where we are right now?
I mean, I just can't believe that JFK is still actually alive.
I know. Foucault was a CIA plant, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Of course. 100%.
100%.
See?
Yeah.
You broke it here, folks.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Have I talked to you about our Lord and Savior QAnon? I don't know. Are we going to go there? Yeah. All right. So,
what a turn.
Where we go one, we go all.
Oh, God. Well done. I love that Musketeers reference. Oh, wait. No, that's not. Yeah. Okay. Three Musketeers. I can't remember now. And then my brain just went to Leonardo DiCaprio.
Riffin',
that's
baby.
The Man in the Mask. Different movie.
Yes,
wow, this is
one.
All right. You have sent me down the rabbit hole.
We are riffing now. We're good.
All right.
There's only
a product of
Leonardo
pure
DiCaprio.
That's just language.
Leonardo DiCaprio
Yes.
does not exist. It's just a pure,
There's no there.
I'm a pure constructivist on the question of DiCaprio.
Yeah. Like when he fought a bear, we all know that man is Jesus. He's Jesus.
Exactly.
So, how did we get here? So on the one hand, I totally share. I mean, I'm glad you're like, this is obvious. I feel like that's the highest compliment in philosophy, and we don't realize that. So when you're like, yeah, this seems really obvious. Let me try and be sympathetic to where I think some of this is coming from. I, of course, will still refrain from being sympathetic to the argument, but let's say maybe the origins. Go back to people like Paul Hunt in the UK, who helped start the 𝘼𝙗𝙙𝙘, the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. Go back to people like Ed Roberts in his fights against UC Berkeley that kicked off what we call the independent living movement in the United States. And when you read, their explanations of what they were doing, and you read their arguments, it is so visceral how they are trying to get people to stop thinking that their material body or mind is the problem, and they're pointing at, look at the society, look at this, it's just this really heavy duty effort just to get someone, to change that. And let's not forget with Ed Roberts, I mean, he was in an iron lung for part of the time, if I remember the story correctly. So like, try and get someone, imagine you're talking with someone who is in an iron lung, and they're like, the problem is this building, or the problem is the administration. And you can feel, even if you in general, of course, I don't mean you, Lillian, that is hard, I think, even for someone who is working to fight against every ableist intuition in the world. That is a hard thing, to not see the person in the iron lung as largely having problems just at the level of their body. So I think much of the movement towards social constructionism, including the vulgar, way off the charts forms, is a reflex from this type of, well, you try convincing people when you're sitting in an iron lung that the problem is them and the society. Now, does that justify going too far? Absolutely not. And this is again why I think the fights in the 90s in particular, not just Susan Wendell, Tom Shakespeare, Liz Crow, a number of these authors are like, hold on, we need to talk about material bodies too. And there's a mirroring, of course, of the turn to matter in certain pockets of feminist theory and later queer theory. But for some reason, I feel like some of the more extreme forms of social constructionism still lived on in certain pockets of DS discourse. And I think there are some people who just think that they're in that fight. Still, the fight that Ed Roberts and Paul Hunt and some of these people were. And I just think that's an incorrect analysis.
Well, there just does seem to be like an anxiety, right? That like claiming that there is something real, extra discursively real or true about a body at all is somehow like a reactionary move.
Yeah.
Right. Like there's like a word.
Yeah. Like you're already in eugenics as soon as you do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. And maybe this hooks back up with the larger claims they're making about nation state building and capitalism and white supremacy and all that jazz. I think of Stacy Simplican's book called The Capacity Contract. And in many ways, I view that, it's written purposefully in the genre or with the framework that we get from Carol Pateman and Charles Mills. I heard he's in the hospital right now. I hope. I'm really bless his amazing soul.
No kidding.
So the intensity with which someone might want to say, stop focusing on embodied differences is hard to overstate both at personal and political levels. And I think Simplican's work really lays out an interesting dimension of that. I feel like the good news is that the argument I'm making in this piece, I feel like most people today who are fighting for disability justice or who identify themselves as disability justice advocates think the kind of stronger form of social constructionism is utter bullshit. Like they're very much on the same page as I think, well, certainly I am, but the rest of us are. I'm thinking of people like Talila A. Lewis. I'm thinking of people like Dustin Gibson, people like Lydia X.Z. Brown, people like Leah Lakshmi. I always mess up their last name, but if you Google Leah Lakshmi disability justice, you'll find them. These people have in my view, very sophisticated intersectional analyses that bring in the complexity and messiness of material conditions with the ideals of various sorts of political ends. They're always thinking about disability justice alongside indigenous justice, alongside racial justice, alongside gender and sexuality justice. And I view this from my mostly academic tower vantage point as a really positive development on the ground, and one that I just think is fundamentally more promising, especially considering that climate change, we have to get all on board with systemic changes, or all but the very richest are going to be fucked in various ways. There has to be a more universalizing move here, and the old, more siloed identity politics stuff is just it's just not going to cut it. I don't see how it could possibly cut it for the crisis we're facing. The equality thing, to go back to your original comment, Lillian, that quote you picked out, that's interesting. What's funny is you said it, and I was like, I said that, as often happens with one's writings. I often wonder what disability justice actually implies for the concept of equality. It seems to me that concept just has to be thrown out. You have to have equity. You have to there has to be, again, the people that I was mentioning before. I think disability justice advocates, perhaps more than anyone, want to admit and pay attention to the real, in let's go with quotation marks this time, the real differences between people. Whether what we're saying those differences are at the level of the genomic, the epigenomic, whether we're saying they're merely at the level of social ramifications due to stigma, discrimination, oppression, whatever it might be, we have to pay attention to those differences. And doing so means we cannot equalize them. We cannot just act like everyone should be treated the same, and then that will bring about a better world. And again, I think this is a significant improvement. This is a better approach for the times in which we find ourselves, and we'll see what happens. I don't know. I mean, it's literally before we were about to meet today. Not only was I reading about that $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill that can be passed through reconciliation, right? They only need 50 votes for that in the Senate. But also that Biden just finally went on the record saying, yeah, we're going to probably have to get rid of the filibuster if we want to, protect voting rights. And it was just this interesting moment of like, oh, incrementalism, hasn't been going so well. Like, maybe we need a little bit more.
It's not been going so well.
Yeah, maybe we need some more heavy hitting stuff at the federal level that like protects voting.
This is my whole new thing. I'm like about breaking down the federal system, man. And the more I think about it, the more I'm like, this is the main problem. Like in terms of political institutions, because like a lot of the things that I worry about, whether it's rights or just like social programs, like when you think about like the fundamental like crippling nature of like the state, like the federal system, and that like the biggest improvements of people's lives have like 90% of the time come from like federal action when they were able to like for various political reasons override. I mean, I get that states' rights has a particular history, but I mean in the not just in the white supremacist sense, but like in the general sense, like be able to just take control over the federal system. There's the capitalism problem, but it's like, this is like the obstacle to reform. Like the more I like get this in my head, the more I'm like, you have to do things at the federal level. Otherwise, like the state capacity in this country is like never going to be built up sufficiently to solve any of our problems, like even a little bit.
Yeah. And even beyond that, I could go on and on being critical of things like the United Nations, especially if you know its history, dear God, and the World Health Organization and all of this stuff, and their imbrication with things like the World Bank and the IMF. I digress. The point is, it is still the case that I just don't understand how we're going to address climate change if there isn't some international body that actually has teeth. Yeah.
No kidding.
Like the teethlessness.
It's necessary.
Yeah, like
it's unavoidable, right? Yeah. I don't see any way around it.
And as hesitant as I am to put teeth on any international body, and hesitant for all the reasons that anyone paying attention would have, like, what is the other solution? Like, try and make enough money that you get on the ship to go to Mars and, end up killing yourself on the way because Elon Musk is just unbearable in person. That's like the only other route.
That's not going to work for me personally.
And also, Teslas are built like shit.
I didn't actually know that.
My man does not know how to build a car.
I just saw like some stuff on Twitter of people being like, finally got my Tesla. Oh, my steering wheel came off. But I know this happens to all of y'all, and everyone's in this person's mentions being like, the steering wheel has never come off of my car. That's not a thing that happens. That's not a thing.
Oh my God.
All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us here today. Thank you so much, Joel, for joining us today. It was really, really wonderful conversation.
Thank you. That was thanks, great. Joel. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Joel.
Yeah, thank you.
New episodes of What's Up to Philosophy come out every 2 weeks, wherever you get your podcasts. We are shouting out all of our patrons 20 at a time to try to catch up. So starting with the earliest subscribers, today's members who we'd like to thank include 𝙈𝙪𝙨𝙚, VM Mason, John Tappan, Jeffrey Gordon, Moritz Beinhofer, Matthew Ryan, Anton Woronchuk, Caitlin Flowerday, Joshua McAvoy, Tushant Mittal, Kyle Van Derzen, X Vaughn, Gabriel Gottlieb, Sam Bodnett, Eric Smart, Austin Brown, James Spruce, Matt Salud, Larissa Nenning, Connor Upcott, and Sundoku. If you'd like to support the show, like those folks we just thanked, please subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/leftophilosophy. Please follow us on Twitter at @leftophil and follow Joel at Joel M. Reynolds. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Bye now.